The rain drummed against the windows of Chen's family diner, like fingers tapping an urgent message, each droplet catching the amber glow of the single neon sign that flickered between open and darkness. Michael Chen stood behind the worn Formica counter, his calloused hands polishing the same coffee mug for the third time, watching the empty booths that once buzzed with conversation and laughter when Rachel was alive. The diner felt too large and too quiet without her voice, calling orders from the kitchen, without her gentle humming as she arranged fresh flowers in mason jars on every table. Now those tables sat bare except for salt and pepper shakers that had seen better decades, and the flowers had been replaced by overdue bills tucked discreetly beneath the register. The clock above the grill read 2:17 in the morning, but Michael couldn't bring himself to flip the sign to closed, because every customer who might walk through that door represented another day he could keep the lights on, another day he could provide Emma with the stability Rachel had always wanted for their daughter. Upstairs, 4-year-old Emma slept in the small apartment above the diner, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath the handmade quilt Rachel had stitched during her pregnancy, each square telling a story of dreams they had planned to share. Michael's reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a man aged beyond his 32 years, his dark hair now touched with premature silver at the temples, his shoulders carrying the weight of single fatherhood and a failing business that had been in his family for 2 generations. The bell above the door chimed suddenly, cutting through the silence like a prayer answered. And Michael turned to see a figure silhouetted against the storm, a woman clutching a bundle that moved and cried, with the desperate wail of an infant who had forgotten how to be comforted. She stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her worn jacket onto the checkered linoleum, her face hidden in shadow, but her exhaustion radiating like heat from a flame. And in that moment, Michael Chen had no idea that this stranger would change everything he thought he knew about loss, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways that broken hearts could heal. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The woman who stepped into the warm glow of the diner looked like someone the world had forgotten. Her faded jeans torn at the knee, not from fashion but from necessity, her oversized sweater stretched and pilled from too many washings, hanging loose on a frame that suggested she had forgotten to eat more meals than she remembered. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves, was pulled back in a messy ponytail secured with what appeared to be a rubber band, and her face, bare of any makeup, showed the kind of exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. In her arms, she held a baby wrapped in a thin blanket that had once been white but now bore the stains of countless sleepless nights, and the child's cries pierced the air with such raw desperation that the elderly couple in booth 3 exchanged glances before hastily dropping money on their table and hurrying toward the exit. The businessman who had been nursing his coffee and working on his laptop snapped it shut with an irritated sigh, muttering something about finding somewhere quieter as he brushed past the woman without acknowledgement, leaving her standing alone in the doorway like a ship seeking harbor in a storm. The baby's wails grew louder, more frantic, and the woman began to sway back and forth in that universal dance of desperate mothers, her eyes scanning the now empty diner as if searching for an escape route she had already used too many times before. Michael watched her struggle for exactly 3 heartbeats before his feet carried him across the worn linoleum, past the abandoned tables, and through the space where other people's discomfort had created an invisible barrier, because he recognized something in her posture that spoke to every sleepless night he had walked the floors with Emma. When colic had turned their small apartment into an echo chamber of exhaustion, he approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, his voice gentle when he spoke over the baby's cries, asking not what was wrong or why she was there, but simply if there was anything he could do to help, because Michael Chen understood that sometimes the smallest kindness offered to a stranger could be the difference between hope and surrender, between holding on and letting go. The woman who stepped into the warm glow of the diner looked like someone the world had forgotten. Her faded jeans torn at the knee, not from fashion but from wear, Her oversized gray sweater stretched and pilled from too many washings, hanging loose on a frame that suggested meals skipped and sleep abandoned. Her hair, the color of honey left too long in shadow, was pulled back in a careless ponytail, secured with what appeared to be a rubber band, strands escaping to frame a face bare of makeup, revealing dark circles beneath green eyes that held the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind that lived in the soul. In her arms, a baby no more than 6 months old screamed with the relentless fury of an infant beyond comfort, her tiny face red and contorted, her cries echoing off the diner's walls with an intensity that made the fluorescent lights seem to flicker in sympathy. The elderly couple in booth 3, who had been sharing a late-night slice of pie, exchanged uncomfortable glances before the husband quickly pulled out his wallet, dropping bills on the table without waiting for change, both of them shuffling toward the exit with apologetic nods that were meant for Michael but never reached the woman standing in the doorway. The businessman at the counter, who had been nursing his third cup of coffee while typing urgently on his laptop, closed it with a sharp snap, his jaw tight with irritation as he gathered his belongings and brushed past the woman without a single word, his expensive coat creating a barrier between himself and her struggle, as if poverty and desperation might be contagious. Within moments, the diner that had held 5 customers now held only 2. And the woman stood frozen in the entrance, rain dripping from her clothes onto the checkered linoleum, swaying back and forth in that ancient rhythm of mothers everywhere. Her eyes scanning the empty booths with something that looked like shame mixed with resignation, as if this scene had played out before in other places, other nights. The baby's cries grew more desperate, more insistent, and Michael Chen watched the woman's shoulders begin to shake, watched her chin drop to her chest in defeat, and without a single thought for the revenue walking out his door or the peace his remaining hours might hold, he stepped forward, crossing the space between them with purpose, his voice cutting through the chaos with a gentleness that came from knowing exactly what it felt like to stand alone in a world that turned away from inconvenience, asking not why she had come or how long she planned to stay, but simply whether he could help. Because that was the only question that mattered. Michael moved closer with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that a mother protecting her child was a force more powerful than any storm. And when he spoke, his voice carried the soft steadiness of someone who had walked this particular path before, asking gently if he might look at the baby, just for a moment, because he recognized something in the way she cried. The woman's eyes, red-rimmed and swimming with unshed tears, met his with such desperate hope that it nearly broke him. And she nodded, shifting the screaming infant slightly so Michael could see her face, her tiny fists clenched and flailing, her knees pulled up toward her belly in that telltale sign he knew too well. His daughter Emma had cried exactly like this for 3 endless months, those dark nights when Rachel would hand her to him at 3 in the morning, both of them exhausted beyond reason, taking turns walking the floors until they discovered the remedy that Rachel's grandmother had passed down through generations. A recipe that seemed too simple to work but somehow always did. Michael explained this softly to the woman, told her about the colic, about the way a baby's digestive system sometimes needed help finding its rhythm, about how he had once been exactly where she stood now, feeling helpless and alone, and certain that nothing would ever be right again. The woman, who would later tell him her name was Sarah, though he sensed immediately that she was holding something back, watched him with eyes that wanted to believe but had forgotten how, her arms trembling with the effort of holding her baby through another endless night. Michael gestured toward the counter, inviting her to sit, promising that he could prepare something that might help. And though skepticism flickered across her face like lightning in a distant storm, desperation won the battle. And she followed him, sinking onto a worn stool as if her legs had finally given permission to stop holding her upright. He moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, pulling out whole milk from the small refrigerator, measuring it carefully into a small pot on the stove, adding just a touch of fennel seed that Rachel had sworn by, a whisper of chamomile, heating it to exactly the right temperature, not too hot but warm enough to soothe, all while explaining each step in that same gentle voice. Telling Sarah how Rachel had learned this from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers. A chain of mothers reaching backward through time, each one understanding that sometimes the most powerful medicine came not from a pharmacy, but from the kitchen of someone who cared. Michael tested the temperature of the milk against the inside of his wrist. The way Rachel had taught him. The way his own mother had taught her. And when it was perfect, he poured a small amount into a clean bottle he kept behind the counter for emergencies. Because a diner that had once served families knew to be prepared for anything. He handed it to Sarah with quiet confidence. And she took it with trembling hands, bringing it to her baby's lips with the hesitant hope of someone who had tried everything and expected nothing to work. But within seconds, the screaming stopped, replaced by the gentle sound of an infant drinking, her tiny hands reaching up to hold the bottle, her body finally relaxing against her mother's chest. The silence that followed was so profound it felt sacred. And Sarah stared down at her daughter with an expression of disbelief that slowly crumbled into something raw and broken, tears spilling down her cheeks in rivers that she had been holding back for longer than just this one terrible night. Her shoulders shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded, the kind of crying that happened when a person had been strong for too long and suddenly found a safe place to fall apart. Michael said nothing, simply pushed a box of tissues across the counter and began preparing a plate of food, scrambled eggs and toast, and the kind of simple comfort that his grandmother had always said could heal more than just hunger. Setting it before Sarah along with a glass of water and a gentle insistence that she needed to eat, that taking care of herself was part of taking care of her baby. Through her tears, Sarah whispered that she was just trying to get by. That being a single mother was harder than she had ever imagined. That some nights she did not know if she could make it to morning, and her voice carried the weight of truth mixed with carefully constructed fiction. Because even in her vulnerability, she could not bring herself to reveal who she really was. Michael nodded, with understanding that required no explanation, pulling up a stool on his side of the counter and admitting quietly that he knew exactly what she meant. That his wife had died 6 months ago, that he was raising his 4-year-old daughter alone while trying to keep this diner alive. That some mornings he woke up and did not know how he would survive another day, but then Emma would smile, or a customer would leave an extra dollar tip, or the sun would rise despite everything, and he would find a reason to keep going. One small moment at a time. Michael stood and walked to the front door, flipping the sign from open to closed with a decisiveness that surprised even himself. Because in the 6 months since Rachel's death, he had never once turned away the possibility of business. Never once chosen anything over the desperate need to keep money flowing through the register. But something about this woman and her baby felt more important than profit, more essential than the $20 or $30 another customer might spend. And when he returned to the counter, Sarah was staring at him with an expression that mixed confusion with something deeper, something that looked like wonder at being chosen, at being made a priority by a stranger who owed her nothing. He moved through the kitchen with the grace of someone who had spent his entire life understanding that cooking was not just about feeding bodies, but about nourishing souls, cracking eggs with one hand while adjusting the heat beneath a pan with the other, toasting bread to perfect golden brown, slicing fresh tomatoes he had bought that morning from the farmer's market, even though they cost more than he could afford. Because quality mattered to him in a way that transcended financial sense. He arranged everything on a plate with the care of an artist, adding a small garnish of herbs from the windowsill garden Rachel had planted. And he had kept alive like a promise, setting it before Sarah with a quiet insistence that she eat slowly, that she take her time, that this moment was hers, without conditions or expectations. Sarah, with baby Grace now sleeping peacefully in her arms, stared at the meal as if she had forgotten what it meant to be cared for. And when she finally took a bite, her eyes closed with something that might have been relief or gratitude or simply the pleasure of food prepared with love, and she whispered that she could not remember the last time someone had been kind to her without wanting something in return. They talked then in the way that strangers sometimes do in the deep hours of the night. sharing pieces of their lives that felt safe enough to reveal. Michael, speaking of Emma's first day of preschool when he had cried more than she did, Sarah admitting that she sometimes felt like she was failing her daughter every single day, both of them dancing around the deeper truths while finding comfort in the surface-level struggles they could share without exposing the wounds that still bled beneath. Sarah's phone, which sat on the counter beside her plate, began to vibrate with insistent urgency, the screen lighting up with notifications that scrolled past too quickly for Michael to read. But not too quickly for him to notice the expensive device encased in what looked like custom leather, the kind of phone that cost more than his monthly utilities. She silenced it without looking, but it buzzed again 30 seconds later. And then again, each interruption causing her shoulders to tense and her jaw to clench in a way that spoke of obligations she could not escape even in the middle of the night. Between bites of food that she ate with the unconscious elegance of someone trained in formal dining, Sarah mentioned details that did not quite fit the narrative of a struggling single mother, speaking of her daughter's pediatrician at a medical center that Michael knew charged fees most insurance would not cover, referencing a nanny who had quit last week in a tone that suggested employees rather than the occasional babysitter, catching herself mid-sentence when she almost mentioned the square footage of her home before changing it to apartment. Michael noticed every inconsistency, filed each one away in the part of his mind that had learned to read people during his years serving customers who brought their whole lives through his door. But he said nothing, asked no questions, because he understood that everyone had reasons for the masks they wore, and whatever Sarah was hiding, she was still a mother alone with a crying baby at 2 a.m, and that truth mattered more than any other. The sound of small feet on the stairs drew both their attention, and Emma appeared in the doorway, wearing her favorite pajamas printed with stars and moons, her dark hair sleep-tangled, her eyes still heavy but curious, asking in that fearless way of 4-year-olds why there was a lady with a baby in their restaurant when it was supposed to be bedtime. Michael moved to scoop her up before she could fully descend, but Emma was already crossing the diner with the determined waddle of a child on a mission, stopping beside Sarah's stool and staring up at the sleeping infant with an expression of pure fascination, declaring that the baby was really small and asking very seriously if she could please touch her hand, just for 1 second, if that would be okay. Sarah looked down at the small face gazing up at her with such earnest hope and nodded slowly. Adjusting Grace's position so that one tiny hand was visible, and Emma reached out with the exaggerated gentleness of a child who had been taught to be careful with fragile things, her finger barely brushing the baby's palm before Grace's fingers instinctively curled around it in that reflexive grip that made Emma gasp with delight. Michael watched his daughter's face transform with wonder, watched her whisper to the baby about how she could teach her things when she got bigger, about the park where the swings went really high and the sandbox where you could build castles. And he saw in that moment every reason he fought so hard to keep going, every purpose behind his exhaustion and struggle crystallized in Emma's innocent joy at making a new friend. Sarah stared at the scene with an expression that shifted from surprise to something deeper and more painful, her eyes moving from Emma's careful attention to Michael's face, seeing there a tenderness and presence that made her chest ache with recognition of her own failures, because she realized with sudden and devastating clarity that she had been so consumed by her grief and guilt that she had been merely surviving Grace's existence rather than celebrating it. She watched Michael crouch down to Emma's level, reminding her gently that the baby needed to sleep and they should let her rest, his hand smoothing his daughter's hair with such natural affection that it looked like breathing. And Sarah understood that this man who had lost everything still showed up fully for his child, in ways she had not managed to do despite having every resource money could buy. Emma asked if the baby and her mommy could come back tomorrow, asked if they could be friends, her voice carrying that absolute certainty of childhood, that friendship was a simple matter of declaration rather than convenience. And before Sarah could deflect or make excuses, Michael smiled and said that would be lovely if they had time, that they would always be welcome at the diner, his words creating an invitation without pressure, an open door that Sarah could walk through or ignore as she chose. And in that moment she knew with absolute certainty that she would return, that she needed to understand how this struggling single father managed to be more present with less than she had ever been with everything. Sarah appeared in the doorway of Chen's family diner the following evening, just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that filtered through the rain-streaked windows. And when Michael looked up from wiping down tables, he felt something in his chest lift at the sight of her, standing there with Grace bundled in a slightly cleaner blanket than the night before. She offered a sheepish smile and claimed she had been in the neighborhood, that she remembered he had mentioned the diner made good coffee, her excuse thin and transparent, but delivered with enough vulnerability that Michael simply smiled and gestured toward the same stool where she had sat the previous night, already moving to pour her a cup before she even settled. They talked for an hour that evening, Sarah nursing her coffee while Grace dozed peacefully, the conversation flowing easier than it had the first time, touching on safer topics like the challenges of diaper changes and the mystery of why babies found certain sounds soothing. And when she left, she promised nothing, but Michael somehow knew she would return. She came back 2 days later during the lunch rush, claiming she had a craving for scrambled eggs, staying until the crowd thinned and helping Emma color a picture of a rainbow while Michael worked the grill. The next visit was 3 days after that, then 2 days, then the next evening, each appearance accompanied by a different excuse that both of them recognized as unnecessary but neither acknowledged, because the pretense allowed Sarah to maintain whatever distance she needed while still showing up. Michael began to anticipate her arrivals the way he once anticipated the first snowfall of winter, finding himself glancing toward the door during slow periods, keeping ingredients fresh that he knew she preferred, setting aside time in his chaotic schedule for these moments that felt suspended outside the harsh reality of his struggling business. Emma began asking about Sarah and Grace within minutes of waking each morning, her 4-year-old heart already attached in that swift and uncomplicated way children had of claiming people as family, and Michael understood that whatever connection was forming between their small, broken families was becoming something neither of them could easily walk away from, something that felt like hope taking root in soil that had been barren for too long. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, official and cold, bearing the letterhead of Harrison Properties Management in embossed letters that seemed to mock the faded grandeur of the diner's own hand-painted sign. And when Michael opened it, standing behind the counter where his grandfather had once stood and his father after him, the words "Final Notice of Eviction" seemed to blur and swim before his eyes like ink dissolving in water. He had 60 days to vacate the premises, 60 days to dismantle 2 generations of family history, 60 days to figure out where he and Emma would live and how he would provide for her without the only trade he had ever known, and the paper trembled in his hands with a violence he could not control before. He folded it quickly and shoved it beneath the register, where its presence burned like a coal he could not extinguish. Sarah arrived that evening as she had every evening for the past week, and though Michael smiled his greeting and prepared her usual coffee with the same careful attention, she saw immediately that something had shifted in him. Notice the tightness around his eyes and the way his shoulders curved inward as if protecting a wound. She asked gently if everything was all right, and he lied with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that admitting defeat felt like failure, claiming he was simply tired, that Emma had been restless the night before. But his hands shook when he set down her cup, and she knew with absolute certainty that he was breaking. Every instinct Sarah possessed screamed at her to fix this, to write a check that would solve whatever problem had put that haunted look in his eyes, to use the power and resources she had spent her entire adult life accumulating. But doing so would require revealing that she was not the struggling single mother she pretended to be, would shatter the fragile trust they had built, and expose the web of deceptions she had woven. She sat there torn between 2 impossible choices, watching Michael move through the motions of his work with the mechanical precision of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will, and she hated herself for the secrets she kept, hated that her pride and fear and complicated grief had created a situation where the one person who had shown her genuine kindness was suffering, and she could not reach out to help him without destroying everything. That evening, Emma brought down a drawing she had made in preschool, a picture of their family that included stick figures labeled Daddy, Emma, and Mommy with angel wings. And when Sarah asked about it with gentle curiosity, Michael explained that Rachel had been his wife, that she had died 6 months ago in an accident on Interstate 87, that a delivery truck had run a red light at an intersection and collided with 2 vehicles, killing her instantly, along with another driver. He shared this information the way he might describe the weather, his voice carefully neutral. The pain underneath so tightly controlled that Sarah could see the effort it cost him, and she murmured her condolences while something cold began to unfurl in her stomach. Some terrible premonition she could not yet name. Later, Emma proudly announced that her last name was Chen, that she could spell it C-H-E-N, and Sarah smiled and praised her, while her mind catalogued this information with the unconscious efficiency of someone trained to remember details. When she left the diner that night with Grace sleeping in her arms, she drove not to the modest apartment she had claimed as her address, but to her sprawling estate in the hills. And once Grace was settled with the night nurse Sarah had hired, despite telling Michael she could not afford help, she opened her laptop with hands that already knew what they would find. She searched for the accident, for the date and location Michael had mentioned, and the news articles appeared like an accusation, each one detailing how a Matthews Tech Solutions delivery truck, operated by an exhausted driver who had been working double shifts due to the company's aggressive expansion schedule, had run a red light and caused a fatal collision that killed Rachel Chen, 30 years old, beloved wife and mother, and David Matthews, 29 years old, loving husband and father, the CEO's husband, who had been returning from a charity event. Sarah's vision narrowed to a pinpoint as she read her own company's name. Her own family's negligence laid out in investigative reports that documented the driver's 70-hour work week, the pressure from management to meet impossible delivery quotas, the corporate culture that valued profit over safety. And she understood with sickening clarity that the truck that had killed Michael's wife and stolen Emma's mother was the same truck that had killed her husband and left Grace without a father, that the company she had inherited from her father and been running for the past 6 months had destroyed both their lives with the same act of corporate greed. Sarah sat in her home office, the laptop screen glowing like an accusation in the darkness, and felt the weight of understanding crush her chest until she could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the overwhelming horror of what her family had done to the one person who had shown her unconditional kindness when she needed it most. She had spent weeks sitting in Michael's diner, accepting his generosity and warmth, allowing him to feed her and comfort her and care for her daughter, all while the company bearing her family's name, the company she now controlled, had been responsible for destroying his life and stealing his wife and leaving his child without a mother. The guilt rose in her throat like bile, hot and acidic, and she pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape, a wail of anguish that might wake Grace sleeping peacefully down the hall, oblivious to the fact that her mother was a monster who had taken everything from the very people who had given them shelter. Sarah thought of every moment they had shared, every conversation where she had lied about her circumstances, every time Michael had looked at her with those kind eyes while she hid behind a costume of poverty. And the deception felt like a betrayal so profound she could not imagine how she had ever thought it acceptable. She had told herself she was protecting her privacy, maintaining boundaries, exploring what it meant to be seen as just another struggling mother, rather than a billionaire whose every action was scrutinized and judged. But now she understood that what she had really been doing was playing at hardship, while the man serving her coffee was living the consequences of her family's greed. The investigation reports had been clear, brutally so, documenting how Matthews Tech Solutions had pushed drivers beyond legal limits, how her father's aggressive expansion had prioritized profit over safety, how the culture of the company had created conditions where exhausted workers made fatal mistakes. And though Sarah had been making changes since taking over, had been implementing new policies and safety measures, none of it could bring back Rachel Chen or give Emma her mother or erase the fact that Michael's suffering was built on her family's foundation. She closed the laptop with shaking hands and made a decision that felt like self-preservation but tasted like cowardice. Vowing that she would not return to the diner, could not face Michael knowing what she knew, could not sit across from him and accept his kindness while carrying this terrible secret that connected them in ways he could never imagine. 3 days passed without Sarah's appearance. Then 4. Then 5. And Michael found himself watching the door with an anxiety that surprised him in its intensity, wondering if he had somehow offended her, or if Grace had gotten sick, or if the fragile connection they had built had simply run its course, the way so many things in his life seemed to lately. Emma asked about her new friend every evening, and each time Michael had to admit he did not know when they would return. Watching his daughter's face fall with disappointment that mirrored his own. On the 6th night, just past 11, when the diner was empty except for one regular reading his newspaper in the corner booth, Michael heard it, the unmistakable sound of an infant's desperate crying coming from somewhere outside. Muffled but persistent, cutting through the quiet like a knife. He moved to the window and saw a car parked across the street, in the shadows between streetlights, expensive and sleek, in a way that did not match the neighborhood. And the crying was coming from inside it, Grace's distinctive wail that he had learned to recognize, but Sarah was not getting out, was not coming to the door, was simply sitting in the driver's seat with her head against the steering wheel. Michael did not hesitate, did not stop to flip the sign, or tell his regular customer he was stepping out, just pushed through the door and crossed the rain-slicked street with his heart pounding, because something was very wrong, because a mother did not sit in a car while her baby screamed unless she physically could not move. He tapped on the window gently and Sarah's head jerked up, her face visible in the dim light from the dashboard. Streaked with tears and twisted in an expression of pure panic, her chest heaving with rapid breaths that spoke of someone drowning on dry land. Her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She shook her head at him frantically, mouthing words he could not hear but understood meant, "Go away. Leave me alone." But Grace was screaming, and Sarah was clearly in crisis, and Michael had not survived the past 6 months by walking away when people needed help. So he tried the door handle and found it unlocked, opening it carefully while speaking in that same gentle voice he used with frightened animals and overwhelmed children, telling Sarah that he was here, that she was not alone, that whatever was happening, they would get through it together. Michael crouched beside the open car door, his voice low and steady as he talked Sarah, through breathing exercises he had learned from the grief counselor he had seen twice before, deciding he could not afford to continue, counting breaths in for 4 and out for 6, reminding her gently that panic attacks felt like dying but could not actually kill her, that her body was safe even if her mind was convinced otherwise. He did not ask what had triggered this crisis, did not demand explanations or express frustration at her sudden disappearance, simply stayed present with unwavering patience until Sarah's breathing began to slow, and the worst of the panic started to recede like a tide pulling back from shore. Grace continued to scream in her car seat in the back, and Michael asked quietly if he could take her, if Sarah would trust him to care for the baby while she recovered, and Sarah nodded with the jerky movement of someone not fully in control of their body. Watching through tear-blurred eyes as Michael unbuckled Grace with practiced efficiency and lifted her against his chest, immediately beginning that familiar bounce and sway that somehow seemed to come naturally to him, he carried Grace back into the diner, Sarah following on unsteady legs, and prepared the warm milk remedy that had worked before, getting the baby settled and calm while Sarah collapsed onto a stool and put her head in her hands, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. When Grace was peaceful and drinking quietly, Michael set a glass of water in front of Sarah along with the same box of tissues from their first meeting, and she looked up at him with eyes that held such profound guilt and misery that he almost stepped back from the force of it. She opened her mouth to speak, words tumbling out in a broken rush about how she was not who he thought she was, how she had lied about everything, how she had done something terrible that she could never take back, but then she stopped herself mid-sentence. the confession dying on her lips, because once she spoke the truth, there would be no taking it back, no possibility of preserving whatever remained of this connection that had become the only real thing in her hollow life. Michael watched her struggle, saw her wrestling with something enormous and painful, and simply reached across the counter to place his hand over hers, telling her softly that whatever she was carrying, whatever burden was crushing her, she did not have to carry it alone, that his door would always be open to her and grace, that kindness did not come with conditions or requirements for perfect honesty, because he understood better than most that sometimes people needed safe spaces where they could exist without explaining all the ways they were broken. The letter arrived from Morrison and Associates Legal Group 3 days after the panic attack incident, crisp and professional, informing Michael Chen that an anonymous benefactor had established a trust fund sufficient to cover 12 months of back rent, current rent, and property improvements for Chen's family diner, with the sole stipulation that he continue operating the establishment and maintain its character as a community gathering place. Michael read the letter 3 times, standing in the middle of his kitchen, while Emma ate cereal at the small table, each reading making his chest tighten with a mixture of relief so profound it felt like drowning and suspicion so sharp it tasted like copper. He called the law firm immediately, demanding to know the identity of this mysterious donor. But the attorney on the other end remained professionally pleasant and absolutely unmovable, explaining that the terms of the trust explicitly prohibited disclosure and that Mr. Chen could either accept the gift or decline it. But those were his only options. Michael's pride, that stubborn thing that had carried him through 6 months of single parenthood and business failure, screamed at him to refuse, to tear up the letter and throw it back, because he had never asked for charity and did not want anyone's pity. But his practical mind whispered about Emma's needs and the diner's legacy, and the fact that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The timing gnawed at him like a persistent ache, because anonymous benefactors did not simply materialize out of nowhere, and the only new person in his life, the only one who might have noticed his desperation, was Sarah. But Sarah was a struggling single mother who wore worn clothes and spoke of barely getting by, unless everything she had told him was a lie. He began investigating with the determination of someone who had been a line cook before owning the diner, calling in favors from customers who worked in legal offices, searching public records for any connection between Morrison and Associates and the few people who knew about his financial troubles, staying up late after Emma went to bed to follow threads that led nowhere but deeper into his own paranoia. The money sat in escrow like a judgment, waiting for his decision, and Michael found himself torn between the gratitude that wanted to weep with relief and the anger that burned at being saved by someone who would not show their face, at being reduced to an object of anonymous charity instead of a man capable of solving his own problems. Sarah returned to the diner the following evening, and Michael watched her enter, with eyes that saw everything he had been deliberately ignoring for weeks, the way she carried herself with unconscious authority despite the shabby clothes, the quality of her leather bag that no amount of wear could disguise, the subtle tells of someone accustomed to wealth playing at poverty. He waited until she was settled with grace, until she had taken her first sip of coffee, before he placed the letter from Morrison and Associates on the counter between them and asked her directly if she knew anything about it, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with accusation. Sarah's face went pale, her hand trembling as she set down the cup, and she began to stammer denials that sounded hollow even to her own ears, claiming she had no idea what he was talking about, but her body language betrayed her with the transparency of someone unused to lying effectively. Michael leaned forward, his patience finally fraying after weeks of accepting half-truths, and told her that he was not a fool, that he had noticed the inconsistencies in her story from the very first night, that he had chosen not to press because everyone deserved their privacy. But this was different. This was his life and his daughter's future being manipulated by someone who would not even show him the courtesy of honesty. Sarah's phone, sitting on the counter beside her plate, began to ring with an insistent trill that shattered the tension like glass, and she reached for it automatically before remembering where she was and who she was supposed to be. But Michael's hand shot out and covered hers, his eyes dropping to the screen where the caller ID read Matthews Tech Solutions board chair. And the expensive device itself was clearly visible now that her sleeve had ridden up, revealing a watch on her other wrist that Michael recognized from a magazine Emma's teacher had been reading. A limited edition timepiece that cost more than his entire year's revenue. The phone continued to ring. Urgent and demanding, and Sarah's face crumbled with the weight of maintaining a lie that was dissolving around her like sugar in rain. And when she finally answered with a desperate whisper that she would call back, the voice on the other end, audible in the quiet diner, addressed her as Miss Matthews, asking if she had reviewed the quarterly reports, and Michael stepped back from the counter as if she had physically struck him. The name Matthews, hitting him like a fist to the sternum because he knew that name, knew it from police reports and legal documents and the nightmares that still woke him screaming, knew it as the company whose truck had killed his wife and destroyed his world. The name hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had been burning unseen for weeks, and Michael felt the world tilt sideways as pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity, the expensive phone and the designer watch and the way she had known exactly which pediatric center to mention and the anonymous donation that had arrived precisely when he needed it most. He spoke her full name like an accusation, Sarah Matthews, and watched her flinch as if he had slapped her. And then he said the rest of it. The CEO of Matthews Tech Solutions, the billionaire whose face he had seen in business magazines at the library when he had researched the company responsible for killing Rachel, the woman who had inherited an empire built on the backs of overworked drivers who fell asleep at the wheel and killed innocent people. Sarah stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her coffee. Grace clutched against her chest like a shield, and the words began pouring out of her in a torrent she could no longer contain, admitting that yes, she was Sarah Matthews, that she had lied about everything, but explaining through sobs that racked her entire body that she had not known who he was when she first walked into the diner, that she had been drowning in postpartum depression and guilt and grief, that her husband David had died in the same accident that killed Rachel, that the same truck had destroyed both their lives. She told him about the night she discovered the connection, about how she had sat in her office reading the reports, and understanding that her family's company, the legacy she had inherited from her father, who had built it on profit margins and impossible quotas, had taken everything from both of them, had left Grace without a father and Emma without a mother, had created two broken families from one moment of corporate negligence. Michael stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly the laminate cut into his palms, listening to her confession with an expression that shifted from shock to horror to something that looked like betrayal, cut so deep it might never heal. Because she had known for weeks, had sat in his diner and accepted his kindness while carrying this secret, had let him care for her and her daughter while hiding the fact that her family had murdered his wife. Michael's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and controlled, in a way that was somehow worse than shouting, asking Sarah how long she had known, how many times she had sat across from him, drinking coffee and eating food he prepared while carrying this knowledge, how many conversations they had shared where she could have told him the truth but chose instead to continue playing her role as a struggling mother seeking refuge in his diner. He told her that he understood grief, understood the weight of losing a spouse and raising a child alone. But what he could not understand, could not forgive, was the deliberation of her deception, the calculated choice to keep returning day after day, while knowing that her family's negligence had killed his wife and stolen Emma's mother. Sarah tried to explain through tears that when she first discovered the connection, she had decided never to return, that she had stayed away for nearly a week, that she had been sitting in her car unable to breathe or think because the guilt was destroying her, but that his kindness had been the only real thing in her life since David died, the only moments where she felt like a person rather than a CEO or a grieving widow or a failing mother. She told him that every moment in the diner had been genuine, that her feelings for him and the friendship between their daughters had nothing to do with guilt or obligation, that she had fallen in love with the man he was and the life he had built from ashes, But even as she spoke, she could see in his eyes that her words were landing like stones in deep water, sinking without creating ripples. Michael shook his head slowly, his jaw tight with the effort of containing emotions that threatened to overwhelm him, and told her quietly that she needed to leave, that he could not look at her right now without seeing the company logo on the truck that had destroyed his life. Without wondering if every kind word and gentle gesture had been motivated by guilt rather than genuine care, Sarah gathered Grace with trembling hands. Her face streaked with tears and mascara she had finally started wearing again in recent days, and she whispered that she was sorry, that she understood she had lost any right to his forgiveness, that she would have the lawyers reverse the donation because she knew now that her money could never fix what her family had broken. She walked toward the door on legs that barely supported her weight, turned back once to look at Michael standing behind the counter in the diner that represented everything he had left, and saw in his expression such profound hurt and disappointment that she knew with absolute certainty she had destroyed the one meaningful connection she had found in the wreckage of her life. And then she left, the bell above the door chiming with a finality that sounded like an ending neither of them had wanted, but both had somehow made inevitable. Michael stood alone in the empty diner long after Sarah left, the silence pressing against his ears like water, and he found himself replaying every moment they had shared with the new context of her identity, coloring each memory in shades he had not seen before. He thought about the first night when she had stood in his doorway with Grace screaming and customers fleeing, remembered how she had looked at him when he offered help, and he realized now that the gratitude in her eyes had been more than simple relief. It had been the surprise of someone who had forgotten what kindness without strings attached looked like. He remembered her panic attack in the car, the way she had nearly confessed everything before stopping herself, and understood that she had been carrying the weight of this knowledge like stones in her pockets, drowning slowly under guilt that went deeper than simple deception. The anger that had burned so bright when he discovered her identity began to cool into something more complicated, because he knew what grief looked like, had seen it in his own mirror every morning for 6 months, and Sarah's grief had been real even if her name had been obscured. He thought about David Matthews, about a man he had never met who had died in the same moment as Rachel, whose daughter would grow up without a father just as Emma was growing up without a mother, and he felt the first crack in his fury as he recognized that Sarah had not caused the accident, had not driven the truck, or created the corporate culture that killed their spouses. She had simply inherited the consequences of her father's choices, the same way he had inherited his grief. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, asking in a small voice why Sarah had left so quickly, whether Grace was okay, when they were coming back, and Michael looked at his daughter's worried face and saw reflected there all the joy that Sarah and Grace had brought into their lives over the past weeks. Emma had smiled more in the time they had been visiting than in all the months since Rachel's death, had talked about having a baby sister and teaching Grace things and how Sarah said her drawings were beautiful, and Michael realized with sudden clarity that whatever anger he felt toward Sarah, whatever betrayal he believed he had suffered, his daughter had found something precious in their friendship, something that looked like healing and hope and the possibility of family again. He lifted Emma into his arms and held her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, while she asked questions he could not yet answer. And he understood that the accident had not created victims and villains. It had created two broken people who had found each other in the wreckage and built something fragile and real before the past caught up with them. And perhaps that was worth more than his pride or his anger or his wounded sense of betrayal. Michael woke on the 6-month anniversary of Rachel's death with a heaviness in his chest that felt like drowning. And he knew without question where he needed to be, knew that avoiding the cemetery would not make the grief any lighter or the memories any easier to bear. He dressed Emma carefully in her favorite purple dress, the one Rachel had bought her last spring when the world still made sense, and drove to Riverside Memorial with his daughter singing softly in the back seat, unaware that her father's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. They arrived just after dawn when the grass was still wet with dew and the only sound was birdsong cutting through the silence. and as Michael crested the small hill that led to Rachel's grave, he stopped so abruptly that Emma bumped against his legs. Because there, on the ground beside David Matthews' headstone, which he now realized was only 20 feet from Rachel's, sat Sarah with Grace in her arms, her body curled into itself like something broken beyond repair, her shoulders heaving with sobs that seemed to tear through her with physical force. She was dressed simply in black, her billionaire trappings abandoned, looking more like the struggling mother she had pretended to be than the CEO she actually was, and Michael understood in that moment that wealth had not protected her from grief, that money could not buy back the dead or ease the guilt of surviving or fill the hollow spaces left by loss. He walked forward slowly with Emma's hand in his, their footsteps on the gravel path causing Sarah to look up with eyes so swollen and red they barely seemed human. And when she saw him, her face crumpled further, a broken apology forming on her lips that Michael silenced by simply sitting down beside her on the damp grass between their spouses' graves. Emma, with the wisdom of children who understand emotion better than adults ever could, settled next to Grace and began singing the lullaby Rachel used to sing, her small voice carrying across the cemetery like a benediction. And Sarah and Michael sat together in silence, two people destroyed by the same moment in time, finally allowing themselves to grieve, not as enemies or strangers, but as survivors of a tragedy neither had caused and both would carry forever. Michael reached across the space between them and took Sarah's hand, his fingers closing around hers with a gentleness that spoke of forgiveness, earned through understanding, and Sarah turned to him with tears streaming down her face and whispered that she was sorry. So desperately sorry. And Michael nodded because he knew, had always known beneath his anger, that sorry was all anyone could offer when the universe took everything and left only wreckage and the terrible gift of tomorrow. 6 months later, Chen's family diner still occupied the same corner where it had stood for 2 generations. But something fundamental had shifted in the air inside, a warmth that went beyond the physical heat of the kitchen and seemed to radiate from the people who now ran it together. Michael still worked the grill with the same dedication he always had, but now Sarah stood beside him during the morning rush, learning to crack eggs with one hand and flip pancakes with a kind of focused concentration she had once reserved for board meetings and quarterly reports, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands bearing the small burns and cuts that marked her as someone who had chosen presence over perfection. The diner had been renovated with Sarah's money, but Michael's vision, preserving the worn booths and vintage counter while updating the kitchen equipment and repairing the roof, creating a space that honored the past while embracing the future. Sarah had stepped back from the daily operations of Matthews Tech Solutions, installing a new CEO who shared her commitment to worker safety and ethical practices, choosing instead to split her time between the diner and a foundation she had established in David and Rachel's names that provided support for families affected by workplace accidents. Emma and Grace, now 5 and 1, played together in a corner booth that had been designated as theirs, coloring pictures and sharing snacks with the ease of sisters who had never known a time when they were not family, and customers who came in for coffee often stayed to watch the 2 little girls and the way Michael and Sarah moved around each other with the synchronized grace of people who had learned to trust again. The diner had become something more than a business. It had transformed into a haven for struggling single parents who found free meals waiting for them on difficult nights, for families who needed a place where kindness was given without judgment or conditions, and for anyone who walked through the door carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone, because Michael and Sarah understood better than most that tragedy could either destroy you or teach you that the only way to heal from loss was to transform it into love given freely to others. They had learned that forgiveness was not about forgetting or excusing what could not be changed, but about choosing to build something new from the ruins of what had been taken. And as the evening rush began and the diner filled with voices and laughter and the smell of food prepared with care, Michael caught Sarah's eye across the counter and smiled, because they had both discovered that sometimes the greatest gift life offers after taking everything away is the chance to start again, not by erasing the past, but by honoring it through the simple act of showing up for each other day after day, one small kindness at a time.